In Defense of Woman, Section 6, Marriage, Part 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 26. Disparate unions. This brings us to a fact frequently noted by students of the subject, that first-rate men, when they marry at all, tend to marry noticeably inferior wives. The causes of this phenomena, so often discussed and so seldom illuminated, should be plain by now. The first-rate man, by postponing marriage as long as possible, often approaches it in the end with his faculties crippled by senility, and is thus open to the advances of women whose attractions are wholly meretricious. For example, empty flappers, scheming widows, and trained nurses with a highly developed professional technique of sympathy. If he marries at all, indeed, he must commonly marry badly, for women of genuine merit are no longer interested in him. What was once a lodestar is now no more than a smoking smudge. It is this circumstance that accounts for the low caliber of a good many first-rate men's sons, and gives a certain support to the common notion that they are always third-raters. Those sons inherit from their mothers as well as from their fathers, and the bad strain is often sufficient to obscure and nullify the good strain. Mediocrity, as every Mendelian knows, is a dominant character, and extraordinary ability is a recessive character. In a marriage between an able man and a commonplace woman, the chances that any given child will resemble the mother are, roughly speaking, 3 to 1. The fact suggests the thought that nature is secretly against the Superman, and seeks to prevent his birth. We have, indeed, no ground for assuming that the continued progress visualized by man is in actual accord with the great flow of elemental forces. Devolution is quite as natural as evolution, and may be just as pleasing, or even a good deal more pleasing, to God. If the average man is made in God's image, then a man such as Beethoven or Aristotle is plainly superior to God, and so God may be jealous of him, and eager to see his superiority perish with his bodily frame. All animal breeders know how difficult it is to maintain a fine strain. The universe seems to be in a conspiracy to encourage the endless reproduction of peasants and socialists, but a subtle and mysterious opposition stands eternally against the reproduction of philosophers. Per corollary, it is notorious that women of merit frequently marry second-rate men and bear them children, thus aiding in the war upon progress. One is often astonished to discover that the wife of some sordid and prosaic manufacturer or banker or professional man is a woman of quick intelligence and genuine charm, with intellectual interests so far above his comprehension that he is scarcely so much as aware of them. Again, there are the leading feminists, women artists, and other such captains of the sex. Their husbands are almost always inferior men, and sometimes downright fools, but not paupers, not incompetents in a man's world, not bad husbands. What we here encounter, of course, is no more than a fresh proof of the sagacity of woman. The first-rate woman is a realist. She sees clearly that in a world dominated by second-rate men, the special capacities of the second-rate man are esteemed above all other capacities and given the highest rewards, and she endeavors to get her share of those rewards by marrying a second-rate man at the top of his class. The first-rate man is an admirable creature. His qualities are appreciated by every intelligent woman. As I have just said, it may be reasonably argued that he is actually superior to God. But his attractions after a certain point do not run in proportion to his deserts. Beyond that, he ceases to be a good husband. Hence the pursuit of him is chiefly maintained not by women who are his peers, but by women who are his inferiors. Here we unearth another factor, the fascination of what is strange, the charm of the unlike, heliogabalisme. As Shakespeare has put it, there must be some mystery in love, and there can be no mystery between intellectual equals. I dare say that many a woman marries an inferior man not primarily because he is a good provider, though it is impossible to imagine her overlooking this, but because his very inferiority interests her and makes her want to remedy it and mother him. Egoism is in the impulse. It is pleasant to have a feeling of superiority, and to be assured that it can be maintained. If now that feeling be mingled with sexual curiosity and economic self-interest, it is obviously supplies sufficient motivation to account for so natural and banal a thing as a marriage. Perhaps the greatest of all these factors is the mere disparity, the naked strangeness. A woman could not love a man, as the phrase is, who wore skirts and penciled his eyebrows, and by the same token she would probably find it difficult to love a man who matched perfectly her own sharpness of mind. What she most esteems in marriage, on the psychic plane, is the chance it offers for the exercise of that caressing irony which I have already described. She likes to observe that her man is a fool, dear perhaps, but none the less damned. Her so-called love for him, even at its highest, is always somewhat pitying and patronizing. 27. The charm of mystery. Monogamous marriage, by its very conditions, tends to break down this strangeness. It forces the two contracting parties into an intimacy that is too persistent and unmitigated. They are in contact at too many points and too steadily. By and by, all the mystery of the relation is gone, and they stand in the unsexed position of brother and sister. Thus that, quote, maximum of temptation, of which Shaw speaks, has within itself the seeds of its own decay. A husband begins by kissing a pretty girl, his wife. It is pleasant to have her so handy and so willing. He ends by making Machiavellian efforts to avoid kissing the everyday sharer of his meals, books, bath towels, pocketbooks, relatives, ambitions, secrets, malaises, and business, a proceeding about as romantic as having his boots blacked. The thing is too horribly dismal for words. Not all the native sentimentality of man can overcome the distaste and boredom that get into it. Not all the histrionic capacity of woman can attach any appearance of gusto and spontaneity to it. An estimable lady psychologist of the American Republic, Mrs. Marion Cox, in a somewhat florid book entitled Ventures into Worlds, has a sagacious essay upon this subject. She calls the essay, quote, Our Incestuous Marriage, end quote, and argues accurately that once the adventure descends to the habitual, it takes on an offensive and degrading character. The intimate approach, to give genuine joy, must be a concession, a feat of persuasion, a victory. Once it loses that character, it loses everything. Such a destructive conversion is effected by the average monogamous marriage. It breaks down all mystery and reserve, for how can mystery and reserve survive the use of the same hot water bag and a joint concern about butter and egg bills? What remains, at least on the husband's side, is esteem, the feeling one has for an amiable aunt, and confidence, the emotion evoked by a lawyer, a dentist, or a fortune-teller. And habit, the thing which makes it possible to eat the same breakfast every day and to wind up one's watch regularly and to earn a living. Mrs. Cox, if I remember her dissertation correctly, proposes to prevent this stodgy dephlogistication of marriage by interrupting its course. That is, by separating the parties now and then, so that neither will become too familiar and commonplace to the other. By this means, she argues, curiosity will be periodically revived, and there will be a chance for personality to expand a cappella, and so each reunion will have in it something of the surprise, the adventure, and the virtuous Satanry of the honeymoon. The husband will not come back to precisely the same wife that he parted from, and the wife will not welcome precisely the same husband. Even supposing them to have gone on substantially as if together, they will have gone on out of sight and hearing of each other. Thus each will find the other, to some extent at least, a stranger, and hence a bit challenging, and hence a bit charming. The scheme has merit. More, it has been tried often and with success. It is indeed a familiar observation that the happiest couples are those who are occasionally separated, and the fact has been embalmed in the trite maxim that absence makes the heart grow fonder. Perhaps not actually fonder, but at any rate more tolerant, more curious, more eager. Two difficulties, however, stand in the way of the widespread adoption of the remedy. One lies in its costliness. The average couple cannot afford a double establishment, even temporarily. The other lies in the fact that it inevitably arouses the envy and ill nature of those who cannot adopt it, and so causes a gabbling of scandal. The world invariably suspects the worst. Let man and wife separate to save their happiness from suffocation in the kitchen, the dining room, and the connubial chamber, and it will immediately conclude that the corpse is already laid out in the drawing room. 28. Woman as wife. This boredom of marriage, however, is not nearly so dangerous a menace to the institution as Mrs. Cox, with evangelistic enthusiasm, permits herself to think it is. It bears most harshly upon the wife, who is almost always the more intelligent of the pair. In the case of the husband, its pains are usually lightened by that sentimentality with which men dilute the disagreeable, particularly in marriage. Moreover, the average male gets his living by such depressing devices that boredom becomes a sort of a natural state to him. A man who spends 6 or 8 hours a day acting as a teller in a bank, or sitting upon the bench of a court, or looking to the inexpressibly trivial details of some process of manufacturing, or writing imbecile articles for a newspaper, or managing a tramway, or administering ineffective medicines to stupid and uninteresting patients, a man so engaged during all his hours of labor, which means a normal typical man, is surely not one to be oppressed unduly by the dull round of domesticity. His wife may bore him hopelessly as mistress, just as any other mistress inevitably bores a man, though surely not quickly and so painfully as a lover bores a woman. But she is not apt to bore him so badly in her other capacities. What he commonly complains about in her, in truth, is not that she tires him by her monotony, but that she tires him by her variety. Not that she is too static, but she is too dynamic. He is weary when he gets home, and asks only the dull peace of a hog in comfortable sty. This peace is broken by the greater restlessness of his wife, the fruit of her greater intellectual resilience and curiosity. Of far more potency as a cause of connubial discord is the general inefficiency of a woman at the business of what is called keeping house, a business founded upon a complex of trivial technicalities. As I have argued at length, women are congenitally less fitted for mastering these technicalities than men. The enterprise always costs them more effort, and they are never able to reinforce mere diligent application with that obtuse enthusiasm which men commonly bring to their tawdry and childish concerns. But in addition to their natural incapacity, there is a reluctance based upon the deficiency in incentive, and that deficiency in incentive is due to the maudlin sentimentality with which men regard marriage. In this sentimentality lies the germ of most of the evils which beset the institution in Christendom, and particularly in the United States, where sentiment is always carried to inordinate lengths. Having abandoned the medieval concept of woman as temptress, the men of the Nordic race have revived the correlative medieval concept of woman as angel, and to bolster up that character, they have created for her a vast and growing mass of immunities, culminating of late years in the astounding doctrine that, under the contract of marriage, all the duties lie upon the man, and all the privileges appertain to the woman. In part this doctrine has been established by the intellectual emprise and audacity of woman. Bit by bit, playing upon masculine stupidity, sentimentality, and lack of strategical sense, they have formulated it, developed it, and entrenched it in custom and law. But in other part, it is the plain product of the donkeyish vanity which makes almost every man view the practical incapacity of his wife as, in some vague way, a tribute to his own high-mindedness and consideration. Whatever revolt against her immediate indolence and efficiency, his ideal is nearly always a situation in which she will figure as a magnificent drone, a sort of empress without portfolio, entirely discharged from every unpleasant labor and responsibility. 29. Marriage and the law. This was not always the case. No more than a century ago, even by American law, the most sentimental in the world, the husband was the head of the family firm, lordly and autonomous. He had authority over the purse strings, over the children, and even over his wife. He could enforce his mandates by appropriate punishment, including the corporal. His sovereignty and dignity were carefully guarded by legislation, the product of thousands of years of experience in ratiocination. He was safeguarded in his self-respect by the most elaborate and efficient devices, and they had the support of public opinion. Consider now the changes that a few short years have wrought. Today, by the laws of most American states, laws proposed in most cases by maudlin and often notoriously extravagant agitators, and passed by sentimental orgy, all of the old rights of the husband have been converted into obligations. He no longer has any control over his wife's property. She may devote its income to the family, or she may squander that income upon idle follies, and he can do nothing. She has equal authority in regulating and disposing of the children, and, in the case of infants, more than he. There is no law compelling her to do her share of the family labor. She may spend her whole time in cinema theaters or gadding about the shops as she will. She cannot be forced to perpetuate the family name if she does not want to. She cannot be attacked with masculine weapons, for example, fists and firearms, when she makes an assault with feminine weapons, for instance, snuffling, invective, and sabotage. Finally, no law penalty can be visited upon her if she fails absolutely, either deliberately or through mere incapacity, to keep the family habitat clean, the children in order, and the victuals eatable. Now view the situation of the husband. The instant he submits to marriage, his wife obtains a large and inalienable share in his property, including all he may acquire in future. In most American states, the minimum is 1/3, and failing children, 1/2. He cannot dispose of his real estate without her consent. He cannot even deprive it of her by will. She may bring up his children carelessly and idiotically, cursing them with abominable manners and poisoning their nascent minds against him, and he has no redress. She may neglect her home, gossip and lounge about all day, put impossible food upon his table, steal his small change, pry into his private papers, hand over his home to the Periplaneta Americana, accuse him falsely of preposterous adulteries, affront his friends, and lie about him to the neighbors, and he can do nothing. She may compromise his honor by indecent dressing, write letters to moving picture actors, and expose him to ridicule by going into politics, and he is helpless. Let him undertake the slightest rebellion, over and beyond mere rhetorical protest, and the whole force of the state comes down upon him. If he corrects her with the bastinado or locks her up, he is good for 6 months in jail. If he cuts off her revenues, he is incarcerated until he makes them good. And if he seeks surcease in flight, taking the children with him, he is pursued by the gendarmerie, brought back to his duties, and depicted in the public press as a scoundrelly kidnapper, fit only for the knout. In brief, she is under no legal necessity whatsoever to carry out her part of the compact at the altar of God, where he faces instant disgrace and punishment for the slightest failure to observe its last letter. For a few grave crimes of commission, true enough, she may be proceeded against. Open adultery is a recreation that is denied to her. She cannot poison her husband. She must not assault him with edged tools, or leave him altogether, or strip off her few remaining garments and go naked. But for the vastly more various and numerous crimes of omission, and in some they are more exasperating and intolerable than even overt felony, she cannot be brought to book at all. The scene I depict is American, but it will soon extend its horrors to all Protestant countries. The newly enfranchised women of every one of them cherish long programs of what they call social improvement, and practically the whole of that improvement is based upon devices for augmenting their own relative autonomy and power. The English wife of tradition, so thoroughly a femme couverte, is being displaced by a gadabout, truculent, irresponsible creature, full of strange new ideas about her rights, and strongly disinclined to submit to her husband's authority, or to devote herself honestly to the upkeep of his house, or to bear him a biological sufficiency of heirs. And the German Hausfrau, once so innocently consecrated to Kirche, Kuch, and Kinder, is going the same way. 30. The emancipated housewife. What has gone on in the United States during the past 2 generations is full of lessons and warnings for the rest of the world. The American housewife of an earlier day was famous for unremitting diligence. She not only cooked, washed, and ironed, she also made shift to master such more complex arts as spinning, baking, and brewing. Her expertness, perhaps, never reached a high level, but at all events she made a gallant effort. But that was long, long ago, before the new Enlightenment rescued her. Today, in her average incarnation, she is not only incompetent, a lack, as I have argued, rather beyond her control, she is also filled with the notion that a conscientious discharge of her few remaining duties is, in some vague way, discreditable and degrading. To call her a good cook, I dare say, was never anything but flattery. The early American cuisine was probably a fearful thing indeed. But today the flattery turns into a sort of libel, and she resents it, or, at all events, does not welcome it. I used to know an American literary man, educated on the continent, who married a woman because she had exceptional gifts in this department. Years later, at one of her dinners, a friend of her husband tried to please her by mentioning the fact to which he had always been privy. But instead of being complimented, as a man might have been told that if his wife married him because he was a good lawyer, or surgeon, or blacksmith, this unusual housekeeper, suffering a renaissance of usualness, denounced the guest as a liar, ordered him out of the house, and threatened to leave her husband. This disdain of offices that, after all, are necessary, and might as well be faced with some show of cheerfulness, takes on the character of a definite cult in the United States, and the stray woman who attends to them faithfully is laughed at as a drudge and a fool, just as she is apt to be dismissed as a brood sow. I quote literally, craving absolution for the phrase. A jury of men during the late war, on very thin patriotic grounds, jailed the author of it, if she favors her lord with viable issue. One result is the notorious villainous of American cookery, a villainousness so painful to a cultured uvula that a French hack driver, if his wife set its masterpieces before him, would brain her with his linoleum hat. To encounter a decent meal in an American home of the middle class, simple, sensibly chosen, and competently cooked, becomes almost as startling as to meet a YMCA secretary in a bordello, and a good deal rarer. Such a thing, in most of the large cities in the Republic, scarcely has any existence. If the average American husband wants a sound dinner, he must go to a restaurant to get it, just as if he wants to refresh himself with the society of charming and well-behaved children, he has to go to an orphan asylum. Only the immigrant can take his ease and invite his soul within his own house. End of Marriage, Part 3.